Hey, CivMD here. Welcome to my Deity Difficulty guide for Civilization 5. Today we're going to go through the intro, and also the basics of food, growth, and the tradition policy tree. As a disclaimer, I got into the Civilization game series around 2018. I'm not a full-time YouTuber, but I have around 3,000 hours into Civ 5 and Civ 6. I've also authored a pretty comprehensive and decently popular Civ 6 Domination Victory Guide, which I also put a link below. So with that out of the way, let's begin. Let's start with the first question. Okay, CivMD, why the heck are you talking about Civ 5 in 2024? First of all, Civilization 5 still has a very active player base 14 years after its release. Players are still discovering new ways to play, and I felt it was very important to compile the community's knowledge about this game. Also, Civ 7, which is going to be released in February 2025, recycles many of the game mechanics from Civ 5 to the point that it's more similar to Civ 5 than its direct predecessor, which was Civ 6. If you can play Civ 5 very well, you'll have a very easy time with Civ 7. Let me explain. So here are the 4 key concepts from Civ 5 that's returning to Civ 7. First is the concept of prioritizing growth versus settling. This is also known as tall versus wide. Imagine you having a thriving empire with lots of people living in it. This could be an empire with fewer cities but with more population in each, or an empire with lots of cities, but with a relatively smaller population in each. The first kind is called a tall empire, and the second kind is called a wide empire. To use a real-life example, countries like Japan would be a tall empire, and the USA would be a wide empire. You can grow your civilization by either settling more cities or by focusing on growing your cities to turn them into megacities. And each version of Civ handles this concept differently. So let's compare Civ 5, Civ 6, and Civ 7. When Civ 5 was introduced, it came with a city cap of sorts because if you kept settling without tending to your citizens and actually growing your cities, the empire becomes unhappy. Civ 5 was also the first game in the series to introduce hexagonal tiles, and this meant that each city can own more tiles in a given radius compared to square-based tiles. So overall, the prime objective of the game was growth, and the typical number of cities that you would end up with throughout the game was around 3 to 7. In Civ 6, however, the city cap was essentially removed because you barely had any penalties from keeping your citizens unhappy. Also, Civ 6 brought in districts, which you only get 1 per city. So if you want to maximize your science and culture, you had to settle as many cities as humanly possible. So in a typical gameplay, you wanted at a minimum 15 cities, but the more the merrier. Now in Civ 7, based on the information that we have a hard city cap back again, and you can get some severe penalties if you go over this cap. Although, this cap on the number of cities can increase as you unlock more policies by progressing throughout the game. Another thing that's noteworthy is that your villages, which are like satellite cities, provide food to your major cities automatically without needing any trade routes. So the primary objective goes back to focusing on growth and going tall. And based on the information we have, we get around 5 cities per each major era, likely ending up on 15 or higher at the end of the game. So in a way, Civ 7 is a lot more aligned with the prime objective of Civ 5 as a game, which is to grow your cities. The second concept that's returning from Civ 5 is happiness management. Placating the masses is essential for a ruler. In most Civ games, happy cities provide more growth, production, and other metrics, and you can do this by obtaining luxury resources and fulfilling small quests. But how important this is to make your citizens happy changes between different versions. In Civ 5, if you keep your empire happy long enough, you were able to achieve a golden age, which gave you a boost in production, gold, culture, and everything, for a certain number of turns. Each city could also go into a mini golden age called We Love the King Day if you were able to claim certain luxury goods that a particular city wanted. So one of the best strategies in the game is called Forever Golden, where you try to keep your empire happy as much as possible and continue a golden age as long as possible. Now in Civ 6, this is no longer important anymore because happiness in a city provides only a minor bonus. There is a concept called loyalty, which makes your cities revolt if the loyalty score is low, but this depends a lot less on happiness, but more in terms of whether you install the governor and how many of your own cities you've settled around your particular city. So happiness doesn't matter as much, and it's again about really settling as many cities as possible as long as loyalty permits. Again, there is a forever golden component because there are golden ages in Civ 6, but they're not actually unlocked by happiness, so it's really not about happiness micromanagement. Finally, in Civ 7, we get the Civ 5-esque golden age and We Love the King Day mechanics, but it's rebranded as celebrations and legacy quests. And again, the celebration is triggered by happiness and is exactly the same thing as unlocking golden ages in Civ 5. So now it's forever celebrating, but it's the exact same thing as Civ 5. Keep your empire happy as much as possible and as long as possible. The third thing that's returning for Civ 5 is specialist management. In Civs 5 through 7, you can either assign a citizen to work on food or production tiles, or work as a specialist focusing on science or culture. The more population and food you have, the more citizens you can divert to working on scientific discoveries and cultural advancements, rather than having most of your citizens working on self-subsistence agriculture. Specialist control, as in micromanaging the role of each of your citizens, was very crucial in Civ 5. Although this mechanic exists in Civ 6 as well, the specialists were much weaker in general, and the mechanic was pretty much irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. In Civ 7, this is very important again, is relevant from the very early part of the game rather than mid to late game. Finally, the most important concept returning from Civ 5 are permanent policy choices. So Civ 5, 6, 7 were the games in the franchise that put a huge focus on government policies, and these were either permanent choices that last throughout the game, or came as temporary policies where you can slot them in or out depending on the situation. Typically, the permanent policies are stronger and more game-altering than non-permanent ones. So let's go through each of the games. In Civ 5, we get policy trees like tradition, liberty, honor, etc., which had huge implications in the game. It changes the direction of how the game unfolds. And adopting a policy was permanent and cost a lot of culture and had to be chosen wisely. These are the policy trees in Civ 5. If you look at individual policy trees, you would notice that there are diverging paths and players had to assess the trade-offs between different options very carefully because there's no backsies. If you choose a policy, it's there forever. In Civ 6, on the other hand, there was the policy card system. As you go through the eras, you will unlock new policy cards, but you were able to pick and choose which ones you were slotting at a time, and you could always pay money to go back on your decisions. So unlike Civ 5, any mistake you made weren't really as punishing. But at the same time, most of these policies weren't as strong and game-altering. Now in Civ 7, each of the civilization comes with a simple policy tree that is again permanent. Just like Civ 5, there are some diverging paths to choose and you can go to Tier 1 and Tier 2. But more importantly, when you choose a civilization, you're locked into this tree. So in a way, choosing your civilization is actually like opening a policy tree in Civ 5. So again, since the Civ-specific policy trees are permanent, this is very much like Civ 5. And also the fact that you get 3 ages from 3 different Civs total as you progress throughout the game. This is very similar to Civ 5 where you choose 2 or 3 policy trees plus an ideology as you progress throughout the game. And more about that later. Just to add to how important policy choices will be in Civ 5 is that even your unique units and quarters are now unlocked by particular policies. So again, this permanent policy tree makes Civ 7 very much like Civ 5 in terms of the overall gameplay. And again, the thought process behind choosing a civilization to play in Civ 7 will be very similar to how you choose a policy tree in Civ 5 because each civilization has a very unique policy tree. So practicing how you went through policy tree choices in Civ 5 will make you a better Civ 7 player. So I therefore even organized this entire Civ 5 guide in terms of different policy trees, given how useful it is going to be for both returning Civ 5 players and prospective new Civ 7 players. So that brings us to the table of contents of the Civ 5 guide. We're going to talk about each of the policy trees: tradition, liberty, honor, piety, and then commerce, patronage, aesthetics, and rationalism as well. And the four main concepts I went over in the video in the intro part will be explained as we go along the series. And today, we'll talk about the tradition tree. First, I'll introduce you to some of the basic concepts in Civ 5, which I call the central dogma, and the relationship between food, science, and culture. Then we're going to go over tall versus wide, and then talk about the tradition policy tree and build order, and some of the miscellaneous topics. And we will end with talking about the National College and the 3-city National College game plan. And these are the overall objectives. So understand the basic relationship between food growth, science and culture in Civ 5, understand tall versus wide gameplay, and understand the basic 3-city tradition game plan. Let's start with this blanket statement first. That civilization games are not meant to be accurate history simulators. Civ games are a 4X strategy game with a history flavor. The 4X stands for explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. If you're good at the first three, you can build the most advanced civilization and win. And if you're good at the last one, exterminate, then you can also build the most advanced civilization, but by proxy, by conquering everybody else. This all starts with a good solid population. Your civilization's power comes from the citizens. Whether they're working on the fields or being trained as soldiers, if you have a large population that you can work, then you can use more tiles, and it brings you more science and gold. And more importantly, it gives you more food, and each hex tile usually has at least 1 to 2 food. And per the game's rules, each citizen in your empire will consume 2 food. So if a citizen is assigned to a 2 food tile, they'll be able to feed themselves. But by building farms and other improvements, you will have get some excess food in your empire compared to the number of citizens. And this results in growth, specifically population growth. Having excess food means that your people can have more children, and this goes back to having more citizens. And ultimately, a higher population will result in more production gold and military power. You can also assign your population to be specialists, like I mentioned before, that gives you science, culture, production, and gold specifically. And the relationship between food and science is what I call the central dogma of Civ games, because it holds true for most of the games in the franchise. A higher population directly translates into a higher science level, because in most civilization games, the total science output before any buildings or modifiers are calculated as some number x times the total population. And in turn, a higher science results in a better population growth by providing more advanced agricultural and medical technologies like granaries, water mills, civil service, fertilizers, and the ability to send more trade routes. So there is some sort of symbiosis between food and science, or in a way, it's like the central dogma in molecular biology that describes the relationship between DNA and proteins. Now in Civ 5, though, the central dogma is somewhat modified because it introduces the element of culture and social policies, which influences population growth and science independently. The food culture cycle is especially very important in the early game, and which social policies you start out with has profound implications throughout the game. The food science cycle and the culture science cycle follows later. Basically, culture ignites the food science engine, and it might possibly be the most important yield in Civ 5. The two most popular options for cultural progression in the very early game is tradition and liberty. The tradition tree is the standard direct food culture cycle tree where culture gets you more culture and food gets you more food. The tree generally allows higher food or growth in each city, and we call this overall strategy tall. The liberty tree, on the other hand, is the indirect food culture cycle. And you will get more food and culture, but you will have to settle more cities and build monuments from scratch. So you will have a higher population by proxy by settling more cities. And this overall strategy we call wide. And generally speaking, the more cities you have, the more room to grow and the more resources you can access. However, Civ 5 gives some hard limits against infinite city settlements by giving penalties to happiness, science, culture, and building maintenance costs. The happiness limitation might be the biggest. One of the core rules of the game is that the total amount of population cannot exceed the amount of happiness you gain from luxury resources and coliseums in the Empire. While every population you have costs 1 unhappiness, settling a new city itself causes 3 global unhappiness. So if you settle too many cities, it will take a toll in your empire's overall happiness. And if you have more unhappiness points than happiness points, then your empire stops growing. On top of the happiness penalty, the game also gives science and culture penalties if you settle too many cities. Each city that you found or conquer increases the amount of science you need to unlock a new technology by 5%. So your effective science in a way is decreased by that amount. This goes the same for culture as well, and each city that you found or conquer increases the culture threshold by 10%. So every city is only worth settling if it will contribute to the overall science and culture more than this 5 to 10% threshold increase. Each city you found also needs more building maintenance because it still needs the same infrastructure as any of your other cities. This includes granaries, workshops, libraries, and everything. And each of these buildings cost the same amount of money, but new cities will likely not contribute enough money to pay for this investment until much later. And this is a problem because without money, it's difficult to compete against other civilizations to maintain city-state relations, purchase buildings, or upgrading units. And the most dreaded consequence of going bankrupt is that your science growth will just stop. After a few turns of having 0 gold in your coffers, your science rate will dwindle, and at the end, it just goes to 0 as well. So you really want to avoid this situation. And let me use some numbers to illustrate. Let's say you have a total population for the empire. The empire on the left has 2 cities with 20 population each, and the empire on the right side has 4 cities with 10 population each. So the total population is the same at 40. The total science you get from having these setups is about the same, but a bit in the favor of the empire with more cities, assuming you have libraries, universities, and public schools built in every city. However, the science requirement for for unlocking a new technology is going to be different, because in a 2-city build, you built one more city on top of your capital, so the science requirement goes up by 5%. Whereas in a 4-city build, you built 3 cities on top of your capital, so the science requirement goes up by 15%. If you were to calculate the science to tech requirement ratio, which is how fast you're going to unlock new technologies, you will see that you somehow are slowing down your tech acquirement because you require more science points to unlock a technology, whereas the actual science has not increased as much. So you somehow lowered your essential science. And on top of that, you are paying 6 more unhappiness because you have 2 more cities, and also at least 12 more gold just for the science buildings, and possibly even more with granaries and workshops. So at this time, 14 years since the game's initial release, it is still widely accepted that tall play with 3 to 5 cities is the best way to ensure continued empire growth without too much unhappiness, gold, or other problems. And tradition is the policy tree that helps with tall gameplay the most by default. Liberty and other policy trees are still perfectly viable and often preferred in many scenarios, but we will discuss in another time. Now let's go through each of the policies in the tradition tree. I'll list them in the order that is typically recommended to be unlocked, but these are not hard and fast rules by any means. So, this is generally recommended. So you start from the tradition opener, and you go down on the right path, and usually get landed elite first, then monarchy, then aristocracy. The first 3 policies are all about culture. If you open tradition, you will immediately get 3 culture per turn in your capital. This allows faster border growth, but more importantly, it helps you with unlocking the rest of the tradition tree as quickly as possible. The second recommended policy to get is oligarchy with the shield icon, and it gives you a city defense boost, but this is really just a stepping stone towards the third policy, which is legalism. So now your first 4 cities you found, including the capital, has a free culture building, which is usually the monument, so it gives you +2 culture per turn. So if you have 4 cities and open tradition, you will likely have at least a minimum of 12 culture per turn. You're doing all of this to unlock the 4th and 5th policies as soon as possible. These are the policies that makes tradition tradition. So the first one you should usually go for is landed elite with the apple icon first. This policy gives you 10% production population growth, but also gives you a +2 food in the capital. And this not only increases your population growth speed, but also you can now divert some of your citizens towards production because you don't have to work on exclusively food tiles to maximize growth now. And you can divert this production into building more granaries and more watermills, and this provides even more food. And so this really starts to kick off your population growth. The next policy is monarchy with a crown icon. The policy technically does not give you population directly, but it gives you a happiness and gold boost. It gives you 1 point for every 2 citizens in the capital. So for example, if your capital has 40 population, then you will have 20 more happiness and 20 more gold. And this further increases your maximum population limit. So in essence, it gives you the potential to grow even more. So you can see how this scales up well as the game progresses. Typically, the policy number 4, landed elite, is recommended first before monarchy. But if you are settling 4 or more cities and you need the happiness immediately, it might make sense to go for monarchy first. But in general, you should go for landed elite first. And then the last tradition policy you click is the aristocracy with the pyramid icon. This helps you with wonder building. Generally, you're not really going for early game wonders and deity difficulty. But what this really helps you with is building your national college faster. It'll also give you a small amount of happiness per 10 population in every city. So it helps you a little bit in the later games. And by adopting all of the policies in the tradition tree, you automatically unlock the tradition finisher bonus. And this is a very powerful bonus. First of all, it gives you 15% population growth in every city. So as long as each of your city has excess food, it will grow to the next population point faster. But more importantly, it gives you a free aqueduct in your first 4 cities. So this decreases the amount of excess food you need in the first place to grow your population, and it's by 40%. Without going too much into the math, this is actually huger than you think. If you finish the tradition tree, your capital will grow almost 3 times as fast as before, and your first 3 non-capital cities will grow almost 2 times as fast. This is what leads to the food and science cycle to really start. As I mentioned earlier, the science level is directly proportional to the population. Now that we finished talking about the tradition policy tree itself, let's talk about what the build order is for each city. We'll start with the capital. The typical capital build order is Scout, Scout, Monument, Shrine, Settler, Settler, Granary, and then likely Caravan and Library. Let me go through one by one. You want to get an adequate number of scouts proportional to the map size. 2 is usually enough for small maps, but you will need 3 or more for standard maps. The free culture and city population and tech from scouts discovering ancient ruins beats any other option. The monument comes next. This is technically optional. It can help you go through the traditional policy tree as quickly as possible, but if any of your scouts discovered free culture from an ancient ruin, then this is absolutely unnecessary. The shrine is almost mandatory though. This is highly recommended. The point of it is not to get a religion, but to ideally choose a pantheon that gives you extra culture, like religious idols, that gives you +1 culture and +1 faith per gold and silver, or God of the Open Sky, which gives you +1 culture per pasture. And unless you are spawning next to an expansive desert, for example, you should really go for a culture pantheon rather than a faith-only pantheon. Because in most cases, the culture pantheons are much more reliable. It will at least help you go through the tradition policy tree faster, whereas investing highly on religion might not work out for many scenarios in Deity gameplay. And then you build the settlers. You build the settlers first and then go for their granaries. By the rules of the game, your capital does not grow while it's building settlers, so there is no benefit for building granaries first. And then in your satellite cities, in cities number 2 and 3, typically you will get a granary first and then a library, because the libraries don't give you an immediate benefit when you have a population of 1 to 2. However, the last city that you settle may need the library first before the granary, due to the National College building requiring libraries in all of your cities. And more about that later. After you build the granaries, usually in your capital, you will typically build a trader next. And as you well know, there are 2 different kinds of traders. There's the caravan and the cargo ship. The caravan requires animal husbandry. It can be sent from any city to any city, but only has a range of 10 hexes. The cargo ship requires sailing, which also requires pottery first, so it requires some more science, and has the limitation of only being able to be sent from a coastal city to a coastal city. It does have a default range of 20 hexes, and the yields that you get from the trade is much higher. It is also important to note that there are domestic trade routes and international trade routes. Domestic trade routes require specific buildings like the granary and workshop in order to send food and production. In the early game, it's just going to be food. Whereas international trade routes do not require any buildings. It trades gold and potentially, more importantly, lots of science if you send it to a civilization with more technology than you. If you build a granary in city number 2, you can send the trader from city number 2 to your capital, which gives your capital extra food. You can do this the other way as well. You can build a granary and then a trader in your capital to send food to city number 3 to help it grow faster. In rare cases, if you have a deity AI city within 10 hexes of your capital, you may choose to send the trader to that AI city. This can net you 3 to 4 extra science per turn, which is around half your early science. But in a typical tradition game, it is generally recommended to use domestic trade routes for faster growth. But in Liberty and Honor gameplay, international trade routes might be an absolute necessity. And for some of the other miscellaneous topics, especially, you might have noticed that I never talked about workers. Well, and the most important thing about workers is you don't build them, you steal them. And you can get 1 to 2 workers or even more from a nearby AI civilization. You have to use your water typically for this purpose. And with clever maneuvering, you can even get 3 or 4. And don't be afraid of the deity AI civilization. They're not a threat at turn 15. You can get an additional worker from a nearby city-state. And in deity difficulty standard speed, they start spawning workers around turn 20. The most important to remember about city-states is that you should only declare war against one city-state and no more. Because if you declare against the city-states more than once, or if you declare more than one war against a city-state, make peace, and then declare war again, all of the city-states will be alerted, and you'll be labeled as a warmonger, and you will lose influence faster throughout the rest of the game, even for the city-states that you had nothing to do with. So it's best to declare war against one city-state. Never make peace and just continue to steal workers. The more workers you have, the better. And typically you aim for 1.5 to 2 times the number of cities that you have. So for example, if you have 3 cities, you will aim for 4 to 6 workers. It's important not to automate any workers that you have to improve tiles manually. And if you don't manually choose which tiles to work, they will start building farms. Whereas you should be prioritizing luxury resources, strategic resources, and then bonus resources. And don't forget that you can chop woods to speed up production in your cities with these workers. Lastly, you might ask about, what about wonders? In most cases, in the early game, it's not worth it to build wonders. The deity AI has a technology advantage, so they will have a head start. Occasionally, you can get the Temple of Artemis. It gives you 15% faster growth in all cities, but you will have to delay your settlements, and you'll have to put your capital entirely into production mode without growth, so typically not worth it. The Hanging Gardens is occasionally available, especially when none of the other deity AI civilizations chose tradition. The Hanging Garden requires the tradition opener to build. It gives you a free garden in the city, and this free garden is rather nice, especially if it's built in a city without access to fresh water. So the gardens require a river or lake nearby. And the one early game world wonder that is typically available, though, is the Oracle. I do not know why the deity AI does not prioritize this, but this gives you a free policy and helps you finish the tradition policy tree very quickly. It's relatively not competitive. It also gives you some great scientist points. So overall, if you're going to build one wonder in the early game, it should be the Oracle. Now that we've said and done all of this, we got the food and culture bonuses, and we also have a strong capital with high growth. Then we finish this early game journey by building the National College. The National College is, well, a national wonder. It's unlike a world wonder can only one civilization can build. Any civilization can build a national college. This is like a bonus building that you can build if you build a particular building in all of your cities. And the National College is available to you as soon as you complete building libraries in all of your initial cities. The impact of the National College is to add 50% science as well as a flat 3 science to the city that it was built in. This 50% science boost is a game changer. This is the single biggest source of science in the early game, and you don't see these kinds of multipliers until you reach the modern era for research labs. You will typically build the NC in your capital, which likely has the highest production and highest science due to having a high population. You worked on having a strong food culture cycle so that you can fully capitalize on the National College. And you should try to build the National College as quickly as possible. Chopping down woods and working production tiles are highly encouraged. You should attempt to finish the National College even before finishing the tradition tree, and turn 70 to 80 is a good ballpark on standard speed. And finishing the NC and the tradition policies is when the first phase of the game is complete. And this overall game plan is known as Tradition 3 City NC. This is a game plan that continues throughout the later eras. So in the ancient to classical era, you found good city spots, established a food culture cycle, and finished the National College. And then you go straight into universities in the medieval era, and if you have some spare culture, you can optionally invest in typically commerce. And as soon as the Renaissance era hits, you go into the rationalism policy tree to augment the food science cycle and the culture science cycle. And in the modern era, you choose to choose the right ideology that helps you with your chosen victory condition. So you go from tradition to any of the filler social policies and to rationalism as soon as it's available, and finish with ideologies. But we will talk about the mid to late game in a different episode. So we will discuss further about exploration and how to settle cities in the Liberty policy tree video. We will also discuss piety and honor openings in separate videos. And we will discuss late game management, rationalism, and ideologies through part 5 to 7. And without further ado, let's go to the sample gameplay video. Link in the description below.